All right. According to my notes, what I said was I would give you some time to work on the critical thinking challenge for today. And let me see if I can get the thing to come on. Is there anybody that's new in class? I know you are. We have one person that's new in class today. Anybody else? Okay, so you get to come up and introduce yourself to the class so I can give you the points for playing Marketing Survivor last time that we did on the first day of class. So come up and tell the class who you are, what makes you unique, sell yourself to the class, and then try and find a group who will let you into their group so that you can do the critical thinking challenge with them today on art or science.
Hi, I'm Christian Dumas, and what makes me unique, I feel like, is my language skills, because I know quite a bit of Korean. I've taken Chinese, and I'm taking Chinese this semester, and French, and
So you're trilingual,
yeah.
okay? That's interesting. What else? Why'd you take professional sales?
Because I want to help, like, I want to be in the, help people, like, figure out how to, like, make commercials and that appeal to people, because I see commercials that kind of suck these days. And I want to make better commercials.
Okay, all right, very good. Does anybody want to take, does the group want to take on a member?
They want to have like 6 people.
You can go to their group. All right, so let me know, what was your group?
Internationals.
Internationals, and what was your last name? What was the last name?
Dumas.
Okay, all right, I'll put you in that group. So I told you I'd give you some time today to work on these questions. How many of you have my principles class as well at the same time, at the same semester? So you have done part of this exercise, so you have a leg out. I've changed it a little bit. Is sales and art or science? Justify your answer with 3 examples. It will be slightly different. I think there is more of one in sales than there is in marketing. In marketing, I think it's leans more one way than it does in sales, and so I'll give you that hint. So I think there is a difference between sales as a subfield of marketing and the discipline of marketing as a whole. The second question is everything that we teach on a college campus, for example, political science, biology, sales, marketing, finance, accounting, management, is it an art or a science? Or is there some third category, and then what is the difference between an art and a science? If you look at the Dropbox, I'm going to give you about 15 minutes to think about this, and you can have until midnight tonight to submit your answers if you want to change it after you hear everybody else's answers. If you look at the Dropbox, there are instructions here for you in the Dropbox, so if you don't remember what I said because you weren't taking notes just yet, you can go to your Dropbox, you can look at it. I'm viewing this as a student, so this is what it will look like in your Dropbox, and then that will be due by midnight tonight. So I'll give you about 15 minutes in class to get in your groups, discuss this, and then we will talk about your answers and see what we come up with. This is what I told you we'd do last Thursday, is that right? I'm not off. Okay, all right. I just want to make sure I wasn't forgetting something else that I might have told you. That's what I had in my notes, but sometimes I get distracted and I don't take very good notes as to where we left off. So I'm going to turn the camera off now, and we'll give you about 15 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about your answers. Switch it up so that we can have different people. All right, so I'll turn the recorder back on. I guess what we'll do is we'll start with this group over here, the next group, then we'll go to the back, then there, and here, and there. So, who have you all chosen to be your spokesperson? And you had somewhat of an advantage because she's had the principles class, and we already did this little exercise, or a version of this exercise in principles. So, I'm expecting great things. No pressure.
That's a little pressure.
That's a little pressure?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so for the first question, we said art because crafting a pitch based on consumer audience allows you to be creative. It's also very subjective because sales are constantly changing because you're reliant on both the consumer and the seller. And it can be considered a formal expression because each salesperson will have a different way of doing things regardless of their research. And for the second question, we said science because science is the system of acquiring knowledge, and that's what you do in
Okay.
college. You go to, doesn't matter where you are, you're trying to acquire more knowledge. And for the last one, we said art expresses knowledge while science is the system of acquiring knowledge.
Okay, so you think art and science are intimately related?
Yes.
Okay, I think that's true. I like what you focused on in terms of crafting the pitch. Even, you will do research, and we'll talk about that in this class. In fact, we'll do a critical thinking exercise that tries to mimic what you will do in terms of researching for various types of prospects for a specific product. We'll do something that I attempt to mimic what you'll actually do in the real world. And that can be pretty scientific, how you go about doing that. But yes, once you actually get the meeting, I think your recognition there is important that once you get in front of somebody, if it's the executive suite board or just a single person that you're selling to in a business, you're going to have to modify what you're doing based on the constant feedback that you're getting from your prospect. If you just go through it in a mechanistic sort of way, you can't tailor it towards what they're telling you with their body language, you're going to fail at sales. And so that is very much an art. It's hard to absolutely come up with a scientific way, or at this point in time. Now, maybe in the future, we'll be able to do that. Maybe you'll be able to look at your prospect with your glasses or some other device and be able to instantly analyze and get feedback on what their body language is telling you in a very scientific way. But at this point in time, yeah, it's still about making a human connection, having that contact, and selling a deal. And that is something that is dynamic and not subject to sort of a laboratory kind of constrained environment. So very good. Thank you. All right. Good job.
Okay, so for the first question, our group feels that it is both. It is an art because it's a human created skill. It's subjective, it varies person to person. It's kind of like the beauty's in the eye of the beholder. If you can't figure out a way to contact that person and be interactive with that person, then how can you sell to them? And it's a science because it's a knowledge, it's something you have to learn to do. It's psychological, so it's like you have to know how to get into that person's mind as well as just connect with them. And it's all about predictions. You have to predict numbers, you have to predict sales, you have to predict that person. So there's that. The second question.
Okay, so that is important before I forget this. Forecasting is, and that is we can become extremely scientific in the forecasting of sales based on past numbers and using a technique called linear regression. How many of you have had statistics? So you should know something about linear regression. You can use regression to predict sales fairly easily. And so that is a science, yeah, I think that's correct. Okay, the second question?
The second question, we put again both.
Okay.
Because a college campus is not one or the other. It's always a mix. And then the last question, the difference between art and science. Art is subjective, where science is objective.
Okay, I think that's right. Art is subjective, as they said, it's beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but I'll give you an example after we finish with all the groups on maybe it's not, but I think that's at least one of the things that we've said for millennia now, is that what one person finds beautiful or accepts is not necessarily what another does. And that may be, as you get to greater levels of abstraction, that may very well be the case. What somebody accepts is, for example, how many of you have seen a movie that's rather old now called A Beautiful Mind? Nobody's seen this movie? A couple of you have seen A Beautiful Mind. What is a beautiful idea? Is justice a beautiful idea? Love, is that a beautiful idea? I don't know. That could be debated. Love is fickle, isn't it? Extremely fickle. Is, for example, as we think about this abstraction and this feeling that is something that occurs in the synapses in the brain, is the opposite of love hate? It's not. Hate is a very thin line on the same side of the coin as love. Indifference is the opposite of love. If you're indifferent, that's the opposite. Okay, all right, very good. Look at that.
We said that sales is part of our science. We said it's both. To the science part comes from you have to do the research behind what the buyers want and how the demand is for what you're selling, and the art is based off of your skills required to sell and what and how you go about selling. Is everything an art or science on a college campus? We said yes, it can be both. The classes in itself, there's an art, but then there's a science required to learn, how you take notes, how you listen, kind of things that go about in your class. And then the difference between art and science is, we wrote down that art is the set of skills you have, how you go about pretty much everything it takes skill to do. And the science is the knowledge based on how you go through your classes and things like that. So it's very easy to tell the difference.
Okay, so let's think about in constructing an ad to sell something, based on what you're saying. Let's think about the construction of an ad. What part of that is art and what part of that is science?
Learning about the market that the ad is going into.
Okay.
The science base, and the art is constructing the ad and
Coming up with the
Being
storyboards
creative, yeah.
and that sort of dynamic process and appealing to maybe human emotions. But can we study that scientifically?
yes.
They said psychology is, do you think psychology, your answer was psychology, is that art or science? Or is it witchcraft? I think psychology is witchcraft. Ooh, lay on the couch, tell me what you feel. Okay, very good.
Okay, for the first question, our group said we believe sales is more of an art than a science. It's very important in sales to put yourself, your company, and your product in the best position. The methods to doing this are not always textbook, and a personal opinion or perspective is sometimes necessary. We believe that in sales, relationships are important, and there isn't really a science to establishing a solid relationship. It often varies based on differing personalities. An example of this would be if someone went into a sales pitch with an exact idea in their head of how it's going to go. They can't predict what the customer's perspectives or opinions are going to be, therefore you have to be prepared for things to go differently than you expected. For the second question, we said every college campus has both. There are majors like fashion and dance, which are more artistic, and then there's math and statistics, which obviously involve more science, but we think everything has a little bit of both.
So even physics has a little bit of art.
Yeah, I would say so.
If you ask the physicists this question, they'll say no. But if you ask them why it is they choose to study what they choose to study, it's because of a personal preference. It isn't that inherently subjective in an art, deciding what it is. I mean, if you, for example, are a physicist, how many of you watch Big Bang Theory? A few of you watch Big Bang Theory. My mother insists that I'm Sheldon Cooper. I don't think I'm Sheldon. I'm far more, I get sarcasm. So I think I'm not Sheldon Cooper, maybe Leonard Hofstadter. But Sheldon is a theoretical physicist in Big Bang Theory, for those of you who don't watch it. And he studies what? Anybody know? String theory. String theory is a theoretical physics, and I don't quite understand string theory. But his selection of that and how you go about approaching it is an art. I mean, how you choose to think about this really is a very creative process, even in the most concrete and objective of sciences. I think that there is an art. So I think that's correct. Okay.
And then on the third one, we said, after discussing the differences between art and science, our group concluded that an art is something that has no rules or guidelines. It's unique to each individual, and it is a form of free expression. However, science is something that has rules, structure, and a right and wrong answer. So.
Okay, very good.
So for the first question, we said that sales is an art because sales are pitched differently to everybody. Like I will not be able to sell a product the same way that I will be able to sell to another. And the reasons for that is it's an art because changes can be made to achieve better results. You can build on it. And salespeople, you have to build up to being successful. Just like an artist, sales is open to interpretation. And I think some people say that people are born as a salesperson. I think they may have a good platform, but they still have to build up to it. And then, like I said, everybody's approach is different. And for the second question, we said that there's art, there's science, and then there's both. So, to be specific, we think marketing can be a sales science as well as an art. And then for what is the difference between art and science, we said that science is absolute and art is subjective. And art can be like an individual perception, where science is like a group perception.
Okay, so science is absolute. At one point in time, the scientific community believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. And they based this on observation, didn't they? They didn't have really sophisticated, if we went back, for example, to ancient Greece, and you look at the, people who studied the stars and were using it as navigation, they were probably legitimate in their belief that the sun revolved around the earth, weren't they? Because from their perspective, here on planet Earth, without the benefit of really powerful telescopes, what would it appear to the average person? That the sun comes up and goes down, and that it's going around the earth. And so, were they wrong? Yeah, they were horribly wrong in that. And we find out all the time that things that we thought were absolute laws maybe are not. They're really subject to reinterpretation. Stephen Hawking, the perhaps most famous physicist today, is rethinking, as I understand, many of his earlier hypotheses and theorems. So,
I would argue, though, that you're saying that the study of science is not absolute, but science itself as a concept would be absolute. You see what I'm kind of verbalize here? Does that make sense?
That's a really interesting level of abstraction. Is there something that we can get to? Is there a fundamental principle that we can know a priori? Is there something that we can know with the mind's eye? You're arguing that science is absolute, that there is an absolute truth in it. Okay? What's the origin of the universe?
Well, that's open to interpretation, I got you.
I don't know, is it? I mean, sometimes they really believe, a lot of people really are committed to the
But there is
Big Bang Theory.
There is a true answer out there. We might not have found it yet.
Oh,
But there
okay.
is a true answer
Yeah,
out
I think that's correct. That is true, that is accurate. There is an absolute truth.
Right.
We may not be able to comprehend it
Yeah.
at this point. However, maybe at some point we will. Okay? The last group. Did you talk from last time?
Yeah.
Okay, you can't talk next
No?
time. No, you can talk this time, not next time.
Oh.
They're gonna have to elect somebody else to be their fearless leader.
Great.
I know, you like to talk, but that's okay. They're gonna have to talk too.
Okay, so for the first question, we said that sales is closely related to science. Closely related to science. It is correlated to science because we use psychology,
Okay?
to base our marketing tactics and decisions. We target specific demographics such as class, race, and age. By researching each group, we discover what technique we need to use. And for example, we use like the 3 modes of persuasion: ethos, pathos, and logos. So for the second one, we did on our college campus. Science and art are interchangeable because everything incorporates a science and an art. And so, examples wise, in the business building, marketing can be argued to be both a science and art. Accounting is purely math, therefore it's purely science. However, entrepreneurship can be viewed as an art because they need to access the creative side of their mind to reach out and implement new innovative ideas. And then the last one, we said the difference between an art and a science is the matter of it being subjective versus objective. Art is an individual expression or interpretation of an event, scene, or person, while science is a study of how and why things happen. However, using science in sales, we use it to measure and account for our results and goals. So therefore, we use the analytical side to prove the gains and failures through science.
Okay, so I want to go back to your first one. You said, can you give me your answer to that again? And there's something I want to focus on that you all picked up on. Go ahead.
Sales is closely related to science. It's correlated to science because we use psychology to base our marketing tactics and decisions.
Okay, yeah, I think that's correct. I think that we do look a lot at what people want, and that is fundamentally a psychological question. What is it that people desire? But once you get beyond that, and you're actually in the presentation, again, going back to what other people have said, can you scientifically judge whether or not that person is going to respond positively?
No, but I mean, if you use like previous data, analytics.
Okay. Okay, we'll talk a lot about that, about how you tell before you go into a thing, what type of social style somebody's going to have, so that you're more likely to be successful in that. But think about this, even if you know all of that, and let's suppose you have this meeting with an executive to sell something, and their quarter is off, their wife just had a baby, and their great-granny died. Are you gonna be able to predict that?
No.
That's gonna be really difficult. The things that can impact. We're all in this room, and we would think that we all have a similar experience, but I'd be willing to bet that everybody sees things. What you pick up on, there are subtle differences in the things that you notice, that you highlight, that you think are important from individual to individual. And that can be very difficult to predict. Now, are we getting better at it? Yeah. And again, in the future, can we perhaps really predict things much more accurately with, again, going back to the Big Bang Theory, they have come up with a machine that can judge emotions, so Sheldon goes around with this machine because he apparently can't tell emotions, and it judges accurately. Maybe we will come up with that in the future. And this is a theoretical, thing for their show, but it is, it's entirely possible that based on data points on the facial expression, we can come up with a machine that would accurately predict that. Okay, very good. And you got all of this, right? We have somebody who came in, you just joined, huh? You just joined, right, Jordan?
Yeah, Thursday.
All right, Thursday, you need to give your pitch as to why somebody should accept you in their group. Stand up here and sell yourself to somebody.
Yeah, we gotta do it first.
You had to do this the first day. No, everybody had to do it. You get to come up here. You can't just pick the group. You're gonna have to sell yourself to the group. Introduce yourself to the class and tell them why they should accept you into their group. You gotta sell.
Okay, well, it's not that packed, so I'm not as nervous. Okay, I'm Jordan. I'm a double major, marketing and professional selling at G before. Teaching.
Great.
I'm a suck up right here.
Shameless
Plus,
self-promotion.
that's a plus.
Okay.
He's gonna like, he likes me already. I've already sucked up to him enough. I'm really scared right now. I'm nice.
Tell them why you're nice. Okay. What else? Something else besides you nice. Everybody says they're nice, even though they're not, right?
I'm consistent, I work well with groups, and I'm a team player.
Okay, very good. 3 things. Try and
I'm starting to talk about myself.
Your friend voted on you. I'm not sure about the rest of them.
I don't know if there's only
Oh, you'll take it. Okay. All right. So I can give you the points for the marketing survivor. That's good. So, with regard to these questions, is sales an art or science? I think a lot of you came up with the correct answer, which is it's a little bit of both. But where marketing as a whole, the discipline as a whole, everything from logistics to sales, the spectrum of things that we teach, I think marketing as a whole has become far more scientific. If you went back in time, for example, and read the Journal of Marketing, in the early days of the Journal of Marketing, you would find lots of things that you would understand and you could read. If you want to read marketing, the Journal of Marketing or Marketing Science, today, a lot of you are not going to understand it because it's going to be filled with nothing but these wonderful formulas that they think explains away the world. And so it has become, as a discipline, far more of a science than it used to be, and less of an art. But sales, as a subfield of the marketing discipline, may be more of an art than a science. Because again, you can go through the prospecting process in a very scientific fashion. You can go through product development that you're going to sell in a very scientific fashion. But once you get to the human element, the actual presentation and sale, it's going to be a dynamic process, and some people are going to be able to pick up on this better than others. There are people who, for example, lack empathy. In fact, there's a very popular book about them out now that you might have read, and a lot of these people are very successful. It's called The Sociopath Next Door. And sociopaths have a tendency to be less empathetic, or maybe not at all empathetic, but they can mimic empathy. And some people are just not good at it. Again, going back to Big Bang Theory, Sheldon is just not good with empathy. He has a tendency to be sort of dissociative in his personality. That's a disorder in the DSM-5. So it's going to be understanding that and being able to adapt to that situation very quickly. Now again, this could change. In the next 10 years, we could come up with all kinds of devices that will instantly read your prospect and tell you what's going on with them. I don't know. That's an interesting thought as to whether or not it will become. I think it will move more as we get more and more technologically sophisticated. If we go back, for example, to the 1950s, this is not a supercomputer. But I hold in my hand more computing power than existed in the world at that point in time. I'm able to control the camera with my phone. That was something they never would have thought about in 1950. And that wasn't that long ago. Some of you have parents that were born in the 1950s, or maybe before that. Or you have grandparents that were born in the 1950s. So this is not like this is the Civil War that we're talking about. We're talking about people that are alive on the planet today that have seen radical changes. Is everything on a college campus an art or a science? Most of it is probably a combination of both, leaning more towards one or another. Even the most artistic of classes, let's say drawing 101, there is an art, or there's a science to that art. We know that there are techniques if you want to paint something that has the perception of depth, for example, on a two-dimensional space, a piece of paper. There are ways that you're going to have to do that, and they're sort of scientifically established. The use of color and the mixing is very much science. Is there something else? I think there's a third category, and it may be pure logic. Is a third category. Is there increasing levels of abstraction that don't really mimic anything in the real world that is logical? And you can see this in exams, for example, for those of you that want to take the GMAT, or if you want to go to law school, the LSAT. There are all of these logic games that have no basis in reality, but they are pure logic. And so I think there's a third category. What's the difference between art and science? I think a lot of you got that correct. It has to deal with objectivity versus subjectivity, and the degree to which you have either an objective fact or a subjective opinion. And the more objective it is, the more scientific it is. The less objective, the more artistic it is. However, again, these things are becoming blurred. There is a field in philosophy called aesthetics, which deals with what is beautiful. And forever, philosophers argued that beauty was in the eye of the beholder, and it turns out that may not be true. Philosophers are now actually engaging in something that they never would have done 20 or 30 years ago. They're engaging in quantitative studies. Philosophy as a discipline has relied upon the power of an argument to stand on its own merits independent of any external reference. And yet in this field of aesthetics, where they have forever, for millennium, for 5,000 years, the belief has been that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, it's changing. It turns out that children are enormously honest. And then, so they take babies and they show them pictures. I set them in front of a screen. And a child will focus and laugh. These little itty bitty babies will focus and laugh on a symmetrical face far longer than they will an asymmetrical face. Denzel Washington is almost perfectly symmetrical. And children will sit there, and these little babies will sit there and watch his face for much longer and laugh and giggle and sort of smile. And you flash a picture of Lyle Lovett up on the screen. And for those of you who don't know who Lyle Lovett is, he's a country and western singer, not a very popular one, never was. His biggest claim to fame was that he actually got Julia Roberts, who may be one of the most beautiful women in the world, to actually marry him at one point in time. But he's horribly asymmetrical. He's got one ear that's much higher on his head than the other. His chin is sort of, and his eyes are kind of off, asymmetrical. And you flash that, and these babies just scream. In terms of art, when we ask people to paint an ideal scene, among and across cultures, it turns out that it's the same scene that they all paint, with the same proportions. And so maybe it's less of a subjective exercise than we once thought. So, in the 1960s, we get marketing as a science. This is when we begin to realize that we can study consumers. So there are two foundational disciplines, both of which I will make merciless fun of throughout the course of this semester. There are two foundational disciplines in marketing. One is economics, and specifically agricultural economics, and the second is psychology. And again, I will make merciless fun of psychology because a lot of it, I think, is sort of, particularly in the Freudian tradition, sort of witchcraft. Lay on the couch, let me interpret your dreams. Right? That's, I don't know. But it is the point at which we become much more scientific. The second was agricultural economics, and it was a focus on how you get goods. Once you can produce enough goods for people, and you can produce them cheaply and in a mass quantity, you move beyond the production era where people didn't have very many goods and services, and so they were willing to accept the Model T Ford in black because it was better than the alternative, which is a horse. Once we get into the production, we start realizing that we're going to have to sell. The sales era comes about, and then we can study the consumer from a scientific perspective, and that's what we get in the 1960s. An absolute focus on studying people, doing this in a very scientific data collecting method. Now, there are ways that we do this. One of the ways that we do it is we go through focus groups, or we watch. How many of you watched a television show now? It was very popular about 5 years ago. They've concluded it. It's called Mad Men. It's about the advertising on Madison Avenue. Why are they called Mad Men? Because all the big advertising agencies in the 1950s and 60s were on Madison Avenue in New York. And so you see in that one of the early episodes, they have a focus group where they get these women into a room and they have a one-way mirror behind which the executives and the marketing people are watching these women use products like lipstick, and we actually do that now. There are people who go in, this is called marketing anthropology, and really focus in on how consumers use goods and services. And so we can do that very scientifically, and that lasts until about 1990. And then in 1990 to the present, we recognize something called the relationship era. That it's not just about finding out what the consumer wants and studying them from a scientific perspective, but actually about making them a part of the process. It's a recognition that all consumers have something called customer lifetime value. It's easier to keep a customer than it is to prospect for a new customer. Prospecting is expensive. It's time consuming. So if you can build relationships, you can keep the customer. How do you do this? It's about working with the customer to fulfill their needs and wants through mass customization in many instances. What was one of the first companies to mass customize? Well, it was Dell Computers. You ordered a Dell. You didn't just go buy what they gave you. You could get the processor you wanted, the package or the suite of software applications that you wanted, and then they custom built this very quickly and shipped it out to you. And so that's what we focus on in this era, this idea of building and sustaining relationships with your customers. And it's enormously important. Now, having said that, do you want every customer? You don't necessarily want every customer. You have to, in this process, you have to figure out which customers you don't want. And you don't want every customer. Does Rolex, for example, want to sell a watch to everybody? No, they don't. If they sell a watch to everybody, that's a Timex. It's not exclusive. So they don't want every customer. But the customers that they do have, what do they want? They want them to continue to buy Rolex over their lifetime. And so it's about building these relationships. Now again, this is where it is somewhat of an art. There are different theories about this. What we primarily teach in this course is relationship marketing. But there are alternative methods to this, and there are ones that are coming up. There are ones that are, there's a model called the Challenger model, which if you go into the advanced class, Professor Kaiser will talk about this. This idea that it's not the customer is always right, and you may need to challenge the customer on their beliefs in order to get them to think, and ultimately be more satisfied with their purchases. So, since it is a science, what is the first step in forming? When we decide that we can study something from a scientific perspective, what's the first step that you have to take in order to establish, for example, the science of selling or the science of marketing? What do we have to do? When we decide we can study something from a scientific perspective, what are we going to have to do? Well, the first step is we're going to have to come up with a definition of marketing. We're going to have to decide what is the domain of the discipline. And we have to think about this for sales as well as a subfield of the discipline of marketing. So what is it? Well, we're going to use the scientific method, but before we even apply the scientific method, we're going to have to come up with what is the definition of the discipline. What makes marketing as a field different from, say, sociology? So the two foundational disciplines of marketing are psychology and economics and agricultural economics, focusing on how you get goods from producer to consumer in an extremely efficient way. And there's an author who does a sort of classic. There were these, in the early days of marketing, there were these agricultural economists, and the reason it starts largely in schools of agriculture, and so the great schools in marketing are not, Harvard claims that they have the first marketing department, but the biggest research in the early days of marketing was done at the agricultural schools, because they were really focused on, particularly with agricultural products, which have a what? What happens with an agricultural product as opposed to, say, this remote control as a product? It expires very quickly. It goes bad. If you have milk, why is it that Brahms doesn't go beyond about a 3 or 4 state area? Where did Brahms start?
It's in Tuttle.
It's in, yeah, it started right here in the great state of Oklahoma. And they won't even go all the way, you'll find Brahms in North Texas. You won't find them in El Paso.
I think they said
Yeah. Yeah, they only go as far as they can get. They are a vertically integrated company with regard to their dairy products. They have their own cows and their own dairy, and they produce all of this stuff, and they won't go beyond where they can get it and ship it and maintain freshness quality. So you don't find Brahms everywhere. So these early agricultural economists were worried about how you get this stuff that spoils, unlike this remote control. These markers, as long as you keep the cap on them, will probably last longer than most of us. As long as the cap's on them, they're probably not going to dry out for a long, long time. And so getting them to the consumer in the most time-efficient fashion may not necessarily be really critical, but with regard to dairy products, it is. And so they start doing these studies where they, for example, board trains to see exactly how long and how many stops it takes and what's the most efficient route to get your product from farm to market. There's an author who does a similar study. She's a journalist, but she does what is a classical marketing study in the field of logistics, and she writes a book called 90% of Everything. And it's about shipping. If you ask people what percentage of their goods that they purchase come to us via a container ship, most people say, oh, not very much. Maybe 10 or 15%. It turns out it's what? 90%. 90% of everything arrives by shipping. Now, Apple, the iPhone is actually, Apple buys C-130s, and they fly these over here very quickly. But other phones are shipped on container ships. And what do you suppose it costs to ship a phone? If you don't have an iPhone, let's suppose you have the Google, what's the Google phone called? The Pixel, or you have a Droid. Those are largely shipped on container ships from China. What do you suppose it costs to ship a device this size? A Google Pixel or a Droid?
5 cents?
Huh?
What, 5 cents?
Yeah, you've had my class before, haven't you? Yeah, it's about 5 cents. 3 to 5 cents to ship it to New York, depending on where it has to go. So it's enormously cheap to ship this. And so she gets on a container ship and she follows it through pirate waters from England all the way through to Singapore. And documents how this occurs and what goes on board the container ships and how long they stay in port. It turns out it used to be that ships stayed in port for a long time because it took a long time to load them and unload them, and packages were not necessarily all standardized. Almost everything is standardized now. They're shipped in either 40-foot or 20-foot container units that can be easily picked up. And a ship, a big container ship will be in port for maybe 5 hours now, whereas it used to be they would be in port for days, loading and unloading. They can load and unload hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these containers in a number of hours and then be off to the next port. So what makes this different marketing from sociology, which is also a study? So marketing is a study about people, sociology is a study about people. What makes sociology different from psychology? So psychology is one of the foundational disciplines of marketing, economics is the other, but we've also started branching out and we borrow a lot of theories. One of the great things about being a fairly new discipline is that we can borrow from a lot of other disciplines, and we've recognized that sociology is important. Why is that? What makes sociology different from psychology? What is psychology? The study of, well, not just people, but human what? Right. We can say that biology is also the study of people. What makes the biological study of people different than psychological study of people? Well, biology is going to be focused on what? It's going to be, it's going to be focused on how we actually live. What, the processes that allow us to survive. The systems, the organs, things like that. But psychology is going to focus on the individual, and it's going to focus not on our organs, although that may play a role in our psychology if we're not feeling well, but it's going to focus primarily on what? The mind and behavior. So what makes sociology different? Because it's also the study of people.
Study of people in groups?
It's the study of people. If we go over to the sociology department, they're going to be horrified at my sort of stripping down of their discipline to this. But that's what it is. It's not the study of individuals, but it's the study of groups. Now, why would this be important in marketing? So we start with psychology, but we've now branched out. Psychology is still important to marketing and sales, but we also have to deal with sociology. Why is that?
Like if you want to sell to a group in another country or something?
Yeah. If you want to sell to groups, or if you want to sell to other cultures, that may be important. Cultural anthropology may be important in the study of marketing. And so all of these things, so what makes marketing unique and distinct from that? What is it that focuses on, what is the domain of marketing? Well, it's changed. The National Association of Marketing Teachers, which was the forerunner of the American Marketing Association, in 1935 came up with a definition. And they said, marketing is the performance of business activities that direct the flow of goods and services from producer to consumer. Now, what's wrong with this definition?
From producers to consumers,
Okay, what's wrong with that?
that it's not just like a one-way.
Yeah, this is a very, and one of the reasons that I think we start out with this definition is that when we think about science, we have a tendency to think in very linear terms. Although we may not be linear, modern man insists what makes us different from the primitive world. The primitive psyche, before man started forming groups and societies, viewed man as being intimately related to and a part of the cosmos. They viewed patterns not in terms of a linear fashion, but in terms of cycles. Primitive man, we know this from the anthropological record, viewed life in cycles and intimately connected with the cosmos. The point at which we become historical, man begins to think in this linear fashion and insists that he's not part of the cosmos but distinct and separate from it and only associated with a particular historic event. We are born and we die. And that's a linear process, right? There's a start and there's an end. And you go through this. Primitive man viewed himself very much in terms of cyclical relationships. Is this the way things actually work? And so this definition of marketing is very linear. But is this the way, think about this. The linguist and philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian philosopher, says that, for example, we want our stories, and we insist that our stories are in monoglossia. They follow this. So what is the story line? What's a typical story? Think about movies. There's sort of a beginning, right? Life is great. And then there's some what? There's some conflict that's introduced. And then you have what? You have a resolution, right? So this is the plot line that most stories follow. There's this beginning, boy meets girl. This is the typical plot line. And all is wonderful, but then what happens? Boy loses girl through stupidity. Boy gets girl back, right? It's this linear process. Bakhtin says that's not actually the way life works. Bakhtin insists that rather than linear, we actually talk in what he calls heteroglossia. Think about a typical conversation between a husband and wife. The husband comes home at the end of the day. Hello, how are you? Did you pick up the kids? I had to go by the vet. Now think about that conversation. Did the husband answer the question that the wife asked? No. But there's an understanding between them, right? That, yeah, I got them, but I had to go by the vet first, or something like that. That there's some backstory. It's not necessarily this linear. The way we talk is actually heteroglossia. But our mind thinks in this linear fashion, and so we're going to insist that our stories do it. And that's what this definition is. It's this focus on, I'm going to produce something, and I'm going to try and sell it. So how do we get this flow from producers to consumers? This one-way direction. Producer to consumer, consummation of sale, right? What else is wrong with this besides this linear notion of it?
What it says, the performance of business activity.
Yeah, that's right. This definition strictly focuses on business activities. One of the things that I had you do in the beginning of this class is get up and sell your partner, and then have your partner, and if you came in late, I had you sell yourself to the class. So is sales necessarily just about business activities? Is marketing necessarily just about? No. You all sell yourself constantly. Whether you think about it or not, you market yourself constantly. You want to sell people on the idea that they should like you. If you don't, you will live a very lonely existence. So it's not just about business activities. And I'm out of time, so we'll finish this up and move on next time. I did pass a roll sheet. If you came in late, be sure and sign that.